catching up after nearly 30 years. These are some of the team members who worked in the SABC Parliamentary News Room after 1994, being the first drafters of the history of the new dispensation.
The strength about this team was not only its diversity and the different languages and the different sensibilities it brought to bear, but the different skills that we had. So, for instance, many of you, Denzel in particular, and who'd come at about the time I came, Joseph came a bit later, and Manalisi knew a lot about the actual technical stuff about radio. And whereas I was useless, and Ike was only a little bit less useless. and I do remember going with her to interview Alan Busak, and Denzel wasn't around, about the corruption scandal, and we went to see him in wherever he lived, in Sikofle or Lakeside or somewhere, and we came back and we were trying to cut this bloody tape, we used to do with the razor, and somehow we got it wrong, so that the whole thing ended unraveling. She stood at one end of the passage in the Marx building, and I stood at the other end as we tried to roll it back. And eventually she said to me, ons is net soos twee ape.
If using a dictaphone sounds archaic, Google the reel-to-reel process that these political correspondents had to use to put together radio packages.
Everything was new during those times. So whether it was like technically trying new things, or whether like shaping history was happening kind of day by day. So what a privilege, What an incredible privilege to be around at that time,
Making history while reporting on it. Not only were they reporting on the People's Parliament, they also had to figure out new words.
See, people having to find words for things which you'd never had to find words for in different languages. So Manalisi found the word for AIDS in Xhosa. What was it again? Yeah.
Ukala.
Yeah, Ukala. And then you had found a word for something in isiZulu. I can't remember that, because we were working. We were working on news, and we were also covering the constitutional negotiations. So same-sex rights became a thing. I remember Sam Konazi coming to me and saying, Mandela's made a big mistake.
There was this thing, we come with ways and would analyze them, and somebody would find that, as people are saying, that this is judgmental. We don't have to be judgmental on this. So it was really difficult then, because some of the words, especially in vernacular languages.
The Democratic Parliament was now representative of all South Africans, and with that came the immense task to educate the masses about its role.
Of the National Assembly and the Senate, provincial premiers, commanders of the security forces.
So for many people who had been to school and they understood what the word legislation means, legislative processes are, and so on. And coming from the homeland government, where you had these tribal parties ruling and managing the homeland, and people not having that access to the actual nitty-gritties of what was going on, it was more difficult to send a message down back home to the homeland. And there were questions more, what is this parliament you're talking about? What are these people?
But there was time for lighter moments in between.
There was Johnny De Lange and Mani Skuman. Johnny punched Mani Skuman. But
what he said afterwards is he said he just turned round and his fist happened.
They were witnesses burning the midnight oil when the Constitution was adopted.
I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land.
But then if you remember, do you remember the constitutional process? We would be there at 1 in the morning.
We left at 4:30.
Consisting mostly of members of the political team, the Truth and Reconciliation team was formed. They went to all the different provinces to report on the Commission's work and the stories that were told.
The first day, the first morning, the first person who testified was one of the Kraddock 4 widows. And she started speaking after Tutu asked her something, and then she made a wailing sound that one will never ever forget. It carried with it all the sorrow, all the grief, all the anger, all the questions, all the horror was captured in that one single sound. I remember the next week here in Cape Town, there was a woman who testified who was making tea. She was a tea maker in a building, and she saw something fall across the window outside, and later found out it was her son. And I remember when I sent this soundbite to the news, I was thinking, it's not an important person, it's not a national leader, it's not a rich businessman, it's an ordinary woman, making tea woman in an ordinary building, whose voice is now #1 on our news bulletin.
While it was nearly impossible for team members to remain unaffected, some felt it closer to home than others.
I remember when Thabo Mbeki, for instance, was leading a delegation that was appearing at the TRC and taking ownership of things that happened in exile. And one of the stories, I came to know there and then at that submission that one of my brothers was killed in Angola.
It was incredibly hard work to make everything work, but it was this age of promise in that you had a real commitment to a public broadcaster that was going to reflect the country to itself. And for the first time, we had 11 languages being reported on. Parliament was reported on in 11 languages. The constitutional negotiations that made the final constitution in 1996. And then, of course, the Truth Commission team, led by Anki, as part of the political team.
And where is journalism 30 years later and 20 years from now?
Everybody's just everywhere. So there's no specialization in essence. Today you're doing this story, tomorrow you're doing a health story, the next day you're in Parliament, you're doing another story. But in the good old days, we could specialize, and we saw the need for specialization, languages and all of that, and diversity. Today somehow we've forgotten that, but it's what happens when nobody's investing in the medium.
Zalene Merrington, Parliament.